They say the first thing a ruler forgets is his name, not the one carved into stone or shouted by trembling servants, but the quiet name, the name only a mother speaks in the dark, the one whispered before sleep, before war, before history. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, was not born with that name. He was born with no throne, no peace, and perhaps no childhood. His mother called him Ying Zheng, but even that was not really his to keep. He was born in 259 BCE in a land already at war. Not just war between states, but war of memory, war of loyalty, war of ideas. His father, the future king of Qin, was a hostage in the rival state of Zhao. Ying Zheng was born in enemy territory, and the air he breathed first was not of home, but of fear. His birth was not celebrated with drums or blessings. He was not wrapped in silk or garlanded with jade. He was, by some accounts, hidden, because in the courts of Zhao, the son of a hostage was not a prince. He was a threat, a reminder that one day the man who bowed might rise. So they say his mother, Lady Zhao, kept him close. Not out of love, no one wrote poems about her tenderness, but out of necessity, because in the world of shifting alliances, a child was either a pawn or a liability. When Ying Zheng was 4, he saw a man beheaded in the streets. The man had spoken against the Duke. His blood painted the stone red, and no one spoke of it afterward. But the boy remembered. He did not cry, not because he was brave, but because even then he had learned. Tears are noticed. And noticed things disappear. He grew up surrounded by whispers, servants who bowed too low, teachers who never looked him in the eye, nobles who debated whether he should be returned to Qin or removed quietly. At the age of 8, he was finally taken back to Qin. Not with celebration, but caution. The court was fractured, the old king dying, and Ying Zheng, a child in name, a tool in function, and an enigma in silence. He had no friends, but he had eyes. Eyes that remembered everything. He studied in silence. The classics, the philosophies, the legal codes. But more than that, he studied people, how they lied, how they smiled too widely, how power moved in rooms before voices did. They say one day, when he was 9, a minister asked him, "What does your highness wish to become?" And the boy answered, "I wish to become a shadow that rules the fire." No one understood, but the minister resigned 3 days later. He became king of Qin at 13, a boy wearing jade too heavy for his shoulders, but the crown fit him like silence, awkward at first, then unshakable. They gave him regents, guardians, advisors. He said little, but when he did, they listened. Not because his words were loud, but because he made them feel watched. At 15, he survived his first assassination attempt. A servant slipped poison into his tea. He drank it anyway, and lived. He called the servant's family to court, not to punish them, but to look them in the eye and say, "Was I worth killing?" The mother wept. The servant confessed. The emperor said nothing. But that night he burned his own linens and slept on stone. At 17, he took full control of the throne, and the ministers who once patted his head now bowed to his silence. His first decree was not about taxes or treaties, it was about maps. He ordered that the boundaries of Qin be redrawn, not to show more land, but less. He removed the names of minor cities, villages, and rival noble estates. Only that which obeys, he said, shall be remembered. It was the beginning of a pattern, to control history by controlling what was worth writing down. As he waged wars across the warring states, Ying Zheng did not lead with charisma. He led with inevitability. He listened to no scholars. He consulted no omens. He trusted no ancestor's ghost. Only law and silence. In 10 years, he unified China. Not through glory, but through exhaustion. The other kingdoms fell not because Qin was beloved, but because it was relentless, like rain on stone. One by one, the last kings knelt, and in 221 BCE, he declared a new title, Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. It was not enough to rule the present. He wanted to rule the past. He ordered that history be rewritten. Old texts were copied, then burned. Scholars who resisted were branded. Some buried alive, but not in rage, in ritual, because Shi Huangdi did not see books as enemies. He saw them as rivals. Each word on bamboo was a potential rebellion. Each memory older than him was a challenge. And so, he lit the fires. They say the flames could be seen from the mountains. Whole libraries, works of Confucius, Mozi, Laozi, turned to ash. He stood and watched. Not smiling, not weeping, just observing. A minister once asked him, quietly, "What of the wisdom lost?" The emperor replied, "If wisdom could stop war, we would not need fire." But the fire did not burn books alone. It burned the future. Young scribes stopped writing. Teachers spoke in half sentences. Children asked no questions, because they had learned knowledge has weight, and fire is always hungry. One night, a boy snuck into the archives, a child of a dismissed scholar. He found a copy of the Analects hidden behind false bricks. He read by moonlight, and he wept. Not because of what he learned, but because he realized what had been lost. The next morning, the boy vanished. Some say he fled. Others say the emperor had watched him silently from the shadows. As the fires died down, a new silence swept the empire. Not peace, but absence, of debate, of doubt, of dissent. Shi Huangdi had built a nation forged in law and fear. But the cost was memory. Even the stones seemed afraid to speak. He turned next to immortality. Because what good is control, if death ends it? He summoned alchemists, monks, dreamers. He drank mercury. He slept on jade. He built a tomb so vast it mimicked the sky. Stars above, rivers of mercury below, and 8,000 silent warriors to guard his sleep. But the most telling thing was not what he built, but what he buried. In the hidden chambers beneath his mausoleum, he locked away records of his childhood. Letters, journals, names of servants. He did not want to be remembered as a boy, only as the first. A foreign visitor once asked, "Why erase what came before?" The emperor responded, "Because I do not wish to be compared, only followed." And so, the boy who was never allowed to cry became the man who burned the words grief and question from the lexicon. He ruled with clarity and died with none. In 210 BCE, during a journey to seek the elixir of life, Shi Huangdi collapsed in a carriage. He ordered his death to be hidden for weeks, because even his corpse could be questioned. They say when his body returned to the capital, the stench was masked with salted fish. The first emperor ended as a secret, but secrets do not stay buried. Centuries passed. Dynasties fell. The books were copied again, the words whispered again, the stories remembered. And now, tonight, you too have remembered him. Not the emperor carved in stone, but the boy beneath. But how did the flames begin? Who truly struck the first spark? And were the books burned because of fear, or something far older, far deeper? In Chapter 2, we return to the moment before the fire, to the scholars, the scrolls, and the secret that was not supposed to be read. Close your eyes. The pages await. They say a book is a mirror. It does not command, it does not punish. It simply reflects the one who dares to look inside. But what if a man, a king, a conqueror, a god in bronze and jade, looks into that mirror and sees something he cannot bear? What if he sees not power, but doubt? The burning of the books did not begin with fire. It began with fear, and fear, like ink, seeps slowly into skin, into memory, into law. After Qin Shi Huang united China, he did not celebrate. He did not feast, nor walk among the commoners. He studied the libraries. He walked through halls of bamboo scrolls, their knots tied in ancient wisdom, their words older than his lineage. He read them not as a student, but as a threat assessor. Every word not written by him was a seed he could not control. There was one scroll in particular. It had no title, no known author. Its bamboo slats were stained dark, as if it had been read by men who cried. It told the story of a king who believed he had mastered fate, but he failed because he ignored the voice of a teacher. The story ended with silence, a kingdom lost, a name forgotten. Shi Huangdi read that scroll 5 times. Then he ordered the librarian imprisoned, and the shelf where it was found burned. What unsettled him was not the tale, but the fact that he had never heard it before. How many more voices lived in ink? How many more kings had tried and failed? To control the future, he realized, he must control the past. And to control the past, he must control memory itself. That year, the imperial court issued the Edict of Standardization. It sounded simple. Unify scripts, unify weights, unify history. But in truth, it was a knife, wrapped in parchment. Each state had its scholars, its stories, its heroes, its gods, but Shi Huangdi had no room for gods other than law, and no use for heroes he did not name. The scholars came to court in waves, not warriors, not rebels, but men with scrolls, not swords. And still, the emperor feared them. They wore ink on their fingers like armor. Their words were sharp, precise, unafraid. They spoke of Confucius, of filial piety, of ritual and virtue, of rulers who must be guided by those who study the past. Shi Huangdi listened. He did not interrupt, but his silence was a storm gathering, because to him these were not philosophers. They were insurgents, with bamboo and calligraphy instead of arrows. One old scholar, his beard nearly white, stood before the throne and said, "An emperor who burns books is a man afraid of ghosts." The hall fell silent. Even the stone pillars seemed to flinch. Shi Huangdi did not move. He only asked one question. "And what does the ghost whisper?" The scholar bowed and replied, "That the world will forget you." 3 days later, the scholar disappeared. Some say he was exiled, others buried beneath the royal archives, among the scrolls he once loved. That was when the edict changed. It was no longer about unifying the script. It was about erasing disobedience. He commanded the destruction of any text that did not align with the legalist doctrine. Books on history, philosophy, poetry, gone. Temples became storage rooms. Libraries became ash. The state did not only burn books, it burned permission to remember. Then came the pit. It was not made for books, it was made for men. 460 scholars, Confucians, critics, thinkers, were gathered outside the capital. Some were tricked. Others came willingly, hoping to reason. They were told it was a forum, a symposium, an invitation to speak truth to power. But when the gates closed, truth had no more breath to give. They were buried, alive. The tomb was deep and wide and quiet, like a forgotten thought. The empire awoke the next day, cleaner, quieter. Teachers spoke only of obedience. History began in Qin, and the sky over Xianyang smelled faintly of smoke and silence. Yet even silence carries echoes. In the countryside, old women whispered stories to children under moonlight, stories with no names, no written form, but they lived, passed through lullabies, harvest songs, quiet warnings near the fire. Don't ask too much. Don't speak of the old emperors, and never write what you wouldn't burn. The people remembered, not what was lost, but that something had been lost. And that was enough. Shi Huangdi had created a kingdom of obedience. But in doing so, he had built something else as well. A shadow. It followed him from scroll to scroll, from flame to flame. Not a rebellion, not a ghost. Something worse. A memory that refused to die. In private, he began to dream, not of war, not of power, but of paper. Endless corridors of scrolls. He could not burn fast enough. In his dream, they spoke, but not in words. They breathed, and every breath said, "You cannot silence what was written in sorrow." He awoke sweating. He ordered the walls of his chamber stripped of all writing. Even the blessing carved above his door, erased. One night, he walked the corridors of his palace barefoot. Alone, he passed the hall of archives, now empty. He paused, and he whispered, "I was never afraid of knowledge, only of what it remembers." No one heard him, except, maybe, the ink. But there was something even he could not burn. Something hidden not in scrolls, but in stone sealed beneath the earth. A chamber, a tomb, a secret never meant to be unearthed. In Chapter 3, we follow the path beneath the palace, to the project that consumed him, to the army of silence, to the tomb that breathes. Close your eyes. The soil has something to tell you, and it has been waiting for over 2,000 years. They say a man's legacy is carved in stone, but for Qin Shi Huang, stone was not enough. He wanted silence. He wanted the kind of silence that lasted longer than memory, deeper than myth, heavier than the weight of time itself. And so, he built a tomb, not a grave, a world. The year was 219 BCE. The empire was quiet on the surface, but underneath, beneath palaces and edicts and burnt scrolls, the emperor turned his gaze inward. He had conquered land, people, thought. But there was still one enemy that would not yield: death. He had seen it, in the corpses of scholars, in the stench of rotting kings, in the trembling eyes of his generals. And he hated it, not because it ended life, but because it ended control. He summoned his architects, his astronomers, his mapmakers, his dreamers, and he said, "Build me a palace where the sun never sets, a kingdom beneath the kingdom, and seal it so tightly that even time must knock before entering." They did not ask why. They never asked why, because those who questioned the emperor's silence often became part of it. The site was chosen near Mount Li, a sacred hill in Shanxi, known for its veins of mercury and soil that swallowed sound. Tens of thousands of workers were gathered, not soldiers, but artisans, men with brushes, chisels, and dust on their tongues. For 38 years, they worked in secret, not because secrecy was ordered, but because the project demanded it. It consumed everything: silver, gold, jade, blood, and in return, it promised only stillness. The chambers were vast. Some were said to mimic the great rivers of China. Others mirrored the constellations. Stars placed in perfect alignment, on ceilings painted with crushed pearl and lapis. But the centerpiece was the emperor's throne. Not above ground, not on marble, but deep below, surrounded by silence and the gaze of 8,000 silent men, the terracotta army. They were not statues, not to him. To Qin Shi Huang, they were witnesses. He had buried the words of scholars. But he needed eyes to remember his glory, even in death. So he ordered, "No two faces the same," and they obeyed. Sculptors carved thousands of warriors. Each bore a different expression: stoic, fierce, weary, proud, eyebrows bent by imagined worry, fingernails etched with delicate care, wrinkles where smiles might have once lived. Some looked tired, some looked angry. None looked away, because their purpose was to stare forever. They stood in ranks: archers, infantry, officers, charioteers with bronze reins, horses frozen mid-step, not arranged like a tomb, but like an army on the march, because Qin Shi Huang did not plan to rest. He planned to conquer again, beyond life, beyond flesh, beyond forgetting. But even power that breathes through clay cannot escape fear. He knew his enemies would come for him, if not in life, then in death. So he laid traps: mercury rivers flowing under false floors, crossbows rigged to fire at intruders, rooms sealed with stone so heavy even sound could not climb out. And above it all, layers of earth packed tight as history, as if to press the breath out of the past. The workers who built it, they did not leave. They were honored and then entombed, because they knew the paths, they knew the locks, and the first emperor believed in no second chances. Above ground, the empire kept moving. Laws were carved, borders were guarded, taxes were collected. But below, a secret deepened. A world built not to be ruled, but to be remembered without ever being seen. In the year 210 BCE, the emperor left the capital, not to inspect, not to conquer, but to chase a whisper of immortality. Alchemists had promised him an elixir, a drop of liquid eternity, hidden on a distant island where cranes flew backward and men never died. He believed them because he had to. The journey was long, hot, dusty, restless, and somewhere on that road, between hope and exhaustion, his body failed. Some say it was poison. Others say it was fate finally catching its breath. But what is known is that he died in silence, just as he had lived. But even in death, he demanded control. His ministers panicked, feared revolt if news spread too soon. So they hid his body in a royal carriage, packed it with salted fish to mask the smell. They continued the journey, announcing his rest at every stop. The people bowed, the horses groaned, the sun pressed harder. And in the shadows of that creaking cart, the emperor's dream began to rot. When they reached the capital, the tomb awaited. Dark, ready, open. He was placed on a jade platform, surrounded by rivers of mercury, beneath stars that never moved. No funeral, no drums, no tears, just soil. The tomb was sealed, and with it, so many answers. No one alive had seen its deepest chamber. No records survived. Only whispers remained, that the emperor still sat on his throne, that his heart beat in bronze, that his eyes, though carved in clay, had never stopped watching. And perhaps he got what he wanted. Not immortality of flesh, but something colder, stranger. He was never forgotten, not by name, not by empire, not by fear, but death is a strange bargain, especially when one tries to outwit it. In Chapter 4, we leave the earth behind and enter the myth that followed him. The tale of immortality, of islands that never existed, of potions that promised forever, and souls that wandered far from their bodies. Because sometimes a man can leave the world and still never let it go. Close your eyes, the wind is changing, and something is whispering from the edge of the map. They say even emperors dream, but Qin Shi Huang did not dream of love or victory or legacy. He dreamed of never dying. It began as a whisper in his youth, that somewhere beyond the mountains there lived men who never aged, and women who drank dew instead of wine. He laughed at first, then he listened, then he believed. Because when you have conquered everything else, death becomes the last enemy worth fearing. After uniting the warring states, the first emperor turned his eyes not toward more kingdoms, but toward eternity. He summoned astrologers, mystics, seers, men with long beards and short answers. They read the stars, they burned herbs, they murmured secrets, and they all told him the same thing. The elixir exists, not in Xianyang, not in the mountains, but across the eastern sea on a floating land where cranes lived forever, and the moon never set. They called it Penglai. He dispatched ships, not one or two, but fleets, vast wooden vessels filled with soldiers, scholars, sailors, and supplies. Each time he sent them farther. Each time fewer returned. Some wrecked, some disappeared, and some came back with silence in their mouths and terror in their eyes. But one man, a man named Shu Fu, returned with something different. A story. Shu Fu knelt before the throne and spoke. "Great Emperor, I have seen the mountain of immortals, but it is guarded by monsters, by gods, by winds that hate mankind." He paused, then added, "They will not give you eternal life unless you send children." The court murmured. Ministers flinched, but the emperor nodded. He ordered 3,000 boys and girls to be chosen, strong, pure, young. They boarded ships, they sailed east. They were never seen again. The older he grew, the more the world around him seemed to shrink. He stopped appearing in public. He stopped sleeping near windows. He feared the moonlight might carry poison, or that shadows might steal his breath while he dreamed. He no longer trusted food from palace kitchens. He tasted only from bowls mixed by his own alchemists, who stirred mercury into their medicine and called it essence of the dragon. His hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from the slow poisoning of his own hope. The emperor began hearing voices. He claimed they came from the wind, from mountain caves, from wells that hadn't been used in years. The voices did not shout. They whispered, "You are not ready. You are still flesh. They are waiting." No one dared ask who they were. No one dared speak at all, because by then the court had learned that silence was the only thing that pleased the first emperor anymore. In his private chambers, he built a map of the world, not the world he ruled, but the one he wanted to find. It was filled with islands, drawn by monks who had never seen the sea, and mountains that floated in the clouds. He would sit for hours, tracing his finger along imaginary paths, murmuring, "There, that is where they live." He no longer addressed his generals. He spoke to the wind, to the stone pillars, to himself, and sometimes to no one at all. One night, he summoned a servant and asked, "What is the color of forever?" The servant trembled. I don't know, Your Majesty." The emperor looked at his own robe, dyed in imperial black. He rubbed the silk between his fingers and whispered, "It isn't this." He dismissed the servant. The next morning, that servant was found in the reflecting pool, face down, hands folded. Some said he had drowned. Others said he had seen something a mortal should never witness. The palace grew colder. Lanterns were left unlit. Halls echoed with no footsteps. Even the birds avoided the roofs. It was as if the kingdom itself was holding its breath, waiting. But for what? The end did not come with lightning or fanfare or a voice from the heavens. It came during a journey. The emperor had left Xianyang once more, not to wage war, but to follow a dream that no longer had a shape. He rode in a closed carriage, surrounded by guards who dared not speak and ministers who prayed in silence. He was ill, pale, shaking, but his eyes, those eyes, still burned with command. "We are close," he said. "I can feel them. They are waiting for me." Somewhere on that road, his words stopped. His hand slipped from the curtain. His breath faded into dusk. The first emperor, the man who had buried scholars, burned scrolls, united kingdoms, and defied death itself, had simply stopped. His ministers panicked, but they had practiced this. They stuffed the carriage with salted fish. To hide the smell, they sealed their lips. They announced nothing, because the death of an emperor was not allowed to be ordinary. When they returned to the capital, the tomb awaited. Not just a resting place, but a theater of silence, a monument to control. They laid him down, surrounded by mercury, watching over clay soldiers who never slept. There was no mourning, only ritual. The tomb was closed, and so was the page of a man who had tried to rewrite every other page. But some say, on the night of his burial. A wind passed through the pine trees above Mount Li, and that wind carried no sound. No birds sang, no insects moved, only stillness, deep, full, as if even the earth itself held a moment of fear. But death, for Qin Shi Huang, was never the ending, only a delay, because in the ruins of forgotten scrolls, in chambers that had no doors, in dreams that flicker in the eyes of clay statues, there are still whispers. Whispers of his regrets, his questions, his final words, the ones that were never written down. In Chapter 5, we open the scroll that was never meant to exist. We follow the rumors that refused to die. We listen for the voice of a man who tried to silence the world and ended up haunting it instead. The ink is still wet. History remembers his name. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the man who unified China, burned the past, built walls, buried secrets, and vanished into stone. But history forgets his voice. Not the proclamations etched on bronze, not the laws inscribed on bamboo, not the titles shouted in grand halls. His voice, the words spoken when no one was listening, the questions he dared not ask aloud, the last thoughts before the mercury sealed him in silence. They were never recorded. No court scribe heard them. No scroll survived to carry them. And yet, in the hills beyond Xianyang, where the wind speaks in broken tones, there is a legend, a story passed only from teacher to student, from old lips to younger ears. They say, one scroll survived, not hidden in a tomb, not buried in clay, but carried in the mind of a man who once walked too close to the emperor's shadow. His name is unknown. Some say he was a calligrapher, others a ghost who once had skin. What he left behind was not a document, but a whisper, a single, fragmented memory written in ink that faded the moment it dried, a piece of thought wrapped in silk and buried beneath time. They call it the last scroll, and in it were not laws, not commands, but questions. What is a kingdom if no one dares speak within it? What is immortality if it cannot touch another soul? What is victory if you must erase the map to keep it? No signature, no seal, just brush strokes, hesitant, uneven, as if written by a hand unsure it was allowed to remember. Some scholars dismiss it as fiction, too poetic, too human, not the voice of a man known for conquest, but others, those who still study in silence, those who have seen the emperor's statues under flickering lantern light. They say, this is where he became real. Not in war, not in tomb, but in the echo of his doubt. The man who remembered the emperor's questions, if he ever truly lived, left no monument, no tomb, no descendants, but he may have left a student, and that student, they say, carried the memory not on paper, but in song. A quiet melody played on the Qin, one that never used words, but somehow still asked, "What do you regret?" It was never played in court, never taught in temples, only passed down in mountain villages where old women hum it while tending fires, and blind musicians tune to it under trees that bloom out of season. Some say the melody isn't music, but memory itself, that it carries emotions too fragile for ink, too dangerous for history, that when it's played right, you don't hear it in your ears, but in your chest, and what you feel is his voice, finally heard. In one legend, a young monk once wandered through a ruined temple after a storm. There, beneath the broken roof, he found a single character carved into the stone altar. One word: Jing. Silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that comes after everything has been taken. That monk, it said, wept. He later wrote in his journal, "I have never heard someone say so much with no mouth." Even today, the official history of Qin ends without emotion. It speaks of wars, of reforms, of a tomb that still has not been opened, But beyond the borders of textbooks, in scrolls that smell of dust and salt, in letters smuggled by candlelight, in dreams shared between storytellers, his words remain. Incomplete, fleeting, human. One tale says an artist once sculpted a bust of the first emperor so lifelike that it breathed when no one looked. But when the artist tried to give it a mouth, his hand froze. He dropped the chisel and said, "Some men are not meant to speak, only to be remembered by what they never said." In the quietest corners of history, we don't find emperors. We find people. Not the bronze, the banners, the battles, but the breath between words. The pause in a sentence never finished. The silence that follows, when even power has no one left to speak to. That is where he lives now. Not in tombs, not in terracotta, but in the questions that still echo when the wind rustles bamboo at dusk. What did Qin Shi Huang feel in the final seconds? Was it fear? Was it pride? Or was it a single memory of a simpler time? Before empire, before conquest, when he was still a boy, just learning how to hold a brush. There's a story, not confirmed, not proven, but too tender to ignore. That in his last breath, the first emperor reached for nothing. No scroll, no sword, no decree, only air. As if trying to catch a word he had once spoken and long since forgotten. And maybe that's the truth he could never burn. That we are all written in soft ink. That no matter how strong the wall, how deep the tomb, how loud the title, we fade. And all that remains is how the world remembers our silence. So if you're still here, eyes heavy, heart quiet, let this be your memory of him. Not just the tyrant, not just the emperor, but the man who looked into the face of death and tried, in his own way, to ask, "Will they remember me?" You have, and that is all he ever wanted. Good night, traveler. Sleep deeply. Dream of ancient songs. Let the scrolls close. Let the clay rest. Let the silence speak. And if you wish to walk with us again, there are more forgotten legends waiting to be found. Subscribe if you wish. Not for numbers, but for memory. Because in this quiet place we share, even the lost can still be heard.